In 1852, two brothers opened a blacksmith shop in South Bend, Indiana. They made 25 cents their first day shoeing a horse. By 1900, they were the largest vehicle manufacturer on Earth, and then they decided to build trucks. That decision kept them alive for another 60 years, until it didn't. The Studebaker story doesn't start with engines or assembly lines. It starts with wagons. Clement and Henry Studebaker, Jr. set up shop in South Bend with a forge, an anvil, and not much else. They built 3 wagons their first year, sold 2. But timing was on their side. The California gold rush was pulling thousands of people west, and every one of them needed a wagon to get there. Their brother John was already out in Placerville, California, making wheelbarrows for miners. When he came home with $8,000 in his pocket, the brothers had enough capital to expand. They brought in their youngest brother Jacob, incorporated in 1852, and started chasing military contracts. By the Civil War, Studebaker was building wagons for the Union Army. By 1868, they were the Studebaker Brothers Manufacturing Company. By 1890, they were the biggest vehicle maker in the world. Not car maker, vehicle maker. Wagons, carriages, buggies, harnesses. If it moved and a horse pulled it, Studebaker probably built it. Presidents Grant, McKinley, and Harrison all rode in Studebaker carriages. Annual sales hit $1 million in 1875, $25 million by 1911, $100 million by 1922. This was a dynasty forged in iron and built on wheels. Now here's where it gets interesting. When the automobile showed up at the turn of the century, Studebaker didn't panic. They didn't dismiss it either. They just added it to the lineup. In 1902, they built their first electric car. Thomas Edison bought one. They made electric trucks too, including a 5-ton hauler that generated about 4 horsepower. Slow doesn't begin to describe it. Gas-powered cars arrived in 1904 through partnerships with other manufacturers, and by 1913, Studebaker was building gasoline automobiles under its own name. But here's the thing. They kept right on building horse-drawn wagons alongside the automobiles until 1920. For almost 2 decades, Studebaker sold both, side by side. That kind of adaptability is rare in any industry. It's also the reason the company lasted as long as it did. But cars weren't the only thing Studebaker needed after the wagons. They needed trucks. And this is where the seeds of both their greatest triumphs and their eventual collapse were planted. The first gas-powered commercial vehicles showed up around 1914, panel vans on reinforced car chassis rated at 3/4 ton, priced at $1,200. Not exactly earth-shattering. A 14-passenger bus was added 2 years later. By the late 20s, they were building buses and delivery vehicles. The 30s brought heavy-duty models up to 3 tons. Then, in 1937, Studebaker did something genuinely interesting. They built their first proper light-duty pickup. It shared the Dictator sedan's chassis, front sheet metal, and 6-cylinder engine with a 6-foot box in the back. Raymond Loewy, the legendary French-born industrial designer who'd been hired as a consultant in '36, had a hand in the styling. The result was called the Coupe Express, and it was a genuinely handsome machine, part car, part truck. Decades before Ford came up with the Ranchero or Chevy built the El Camino. Problem was, it cost too much, $647 when a Chevy half-ton started at $515, and a Ford was $526. That gap mattered to Depression-era buyers. Sales fell every year. By '39, the experiment was over. Studebaker had invented the car pickup concept about 20 years too early for the market to care. The all-new M-Series truck arrived for 1941 with unique styling that finally didn't borrow from the passenger cars. A real truck, designed as a truck. It would have been the foundation for a solid post-war lineup. But then, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Civilian production ended in '42. Studebaker kept building heavy-duty M trucks for essential services, but the factory's main output shifted to something much bigger. The U.S. Army needed trucks, lots of them. In April 1941, the government handed Studebaker a contract to produce 2.5-ton tactical trucks at their South Bend plant. The result was the US 6, a 6x6 cargo hauler designed to move men and material over any terrain in any weather. 3 companies shared the wartime truck work. General Motors got the main Army contract with the GMCC-CW. International Harvester supplied the Navy and Marines. Studebaker got the Lend-Lease assignment, which meant their trucks were going overseas, primarily to the Soviet Union. Between June 1941 and August 1945, Studebaker built 197,678 of these trucks. Another 22,204 were built by REO Motor Company under license at their Lansing, Michigan plant. 75% of the Studebaker-built trucks went straight to the Red Army. They were shipped by rail to the West Coast, loaded onto transport vessels, and sent to Iranian ports via the Persian Corridor. From there, Soviet drivers hauled them hundreds of miles over mountain passes and across deserts into Soviet territory. Nearly 3,000 ships were required just for the Lend-Lease crossings. The trucks ran on a Hercules JXD inline 6, displacing 320 cubic inches and making 86 horsepower at 2,800 RPM. Not a lot, but the engine had a compression ratio of just 5.82 to 1, which meant it could run on 72-octane fuel, or whatever the Soviets could scrounge, and they scrounged some terrible fuel. The truck was rated to haul 2.5 tons off-road, but Soviet crews routinely loaded them to 4 or even 5 tons on decent roads. Top speed was 45 miles per hour. Range was about 240 miles on a single 40-gallon tank. The transmission had 5 forward speeds, plus a 2-range transfer case for off-road work. Soviet troops loved these trucks, called them Studers. The word Studebaker actually entered the Russian language as everyday slang for any truck. When a Russian soldier said something was built like a Studebaker, it meant it was tough and reliable, sort of the Russian equivalent of Americans saying something was built like a Mack truck. Joseph Stalin personally sent a letter of appreciation to the company, thanking them for the quality of the US 6. Nikita Khrushchev later wrote in his memoirs about how all the artillery in East Germany was still mounted on American Studebakers years after the war ended. His key point was simple. Without those trucks, Soviet losses advancing from Stalingrad to Berlin would have been colossal because they would have had no maneuverability. The Red Army also found the US 6 made an excellent platform for Katyusha rocket launchers. They stripped the flatbed, welded on steel rail frameworks, and mounted 14 or more high-explosive rockets, mobile artillery built on Indiana truck chassis. After the war, the Soviets liked the design so much they copied it outright. The Gaz-51 used a modified version of the Studebaker cab. The ZIS-151 was structurally based on the US 6 chassis. Those Soviet copies and their descendants stayed in production until the 1990s. Studebaker's engineering DNA ran through Soviet military transport for half a century. So Studebaker came out of the war as a proven truck builder with a global reputation. They had also built over 63,000 Wright Cyclone radial aircraft engines for B-17 bombers. They ranked 28th among U.S. corporations in the value of wartime production contracts. They were the 4th largest automaker in America, employing over 24,000 people in South Bend. The future looked wide open. It wasn't. The company prepared well for peacetime. They launched the slogan "First by Far" with a post-war car and got new models to market in 1947, 2 full years before the Big Three. The cars, designed by Virgil Exner and Robert Bourke, working under Raymond Loewy, were so radically styled that people joked they couldn't tell which direction the car was going. That was actually a compliment. In early 1948, Studebaker launched the 2R Series truck as a 1949 model. This is where the civilian truck story really begins. The 2R was styled by Robert Bork. Born in Chicago in 1916, Bork grew up obsessed with airplane design before shifting to automobiles. He joined Loewy's Studebaker studio in 1941 after Virgil Exner reviewed his drawings and hired him on the spot. $75 a week. Good money for the time. During the war, he worked on military contracts, including Army trucks and aircraft engine assemblies. By the late 40s, he was the only designer in the studio who cared about the truck line. Everyone else wanted the glamorous car projects. Exner gave Bork the go-ahead to try something new, and Bork delivered. The 2R was ahead of its time in almost every way that mattered. It was the first American production truck with fully integrated fenders and no external running boards. The profile sat lower than anything the competition offered. Glass area exceeded any rival pickup on the market. It introduced the double-wall cargo bed, a design where an inner wall absorbed cargo damage while the outer skin stayed clean and dent-free. The gas tank was mounted outside the cab behind the passenger door, a safety feature that Ford, GM, and Chrysler wouldn't adopt in their trucks for another 20 years. Gauges were mounted directly in the firewall, so a mechanic could monitor engine vitals with the hood up, what Studebaker advertised as lift-the-hood accessibility. Bork even stamped the Studebaker name in large letters across the tailgate. He claimed that was an industry first, too. They built these trucks at a brand-new plant on Chippewa Avenue in South Bend, acquired from the military after the war. Also at the Hamilton, Ontario plant, marking the first time Studebaker pickups had been assembled in Canada. The Ontario factory was originally built by the Canadian government for wartime ammunition production. Production boomed immediately, over 48,000 units in calendar 1948, 63,000 in 49, 50 to 60,000 per year through the early 50s. In 1952 alone, the company sold nearly 59,000 trucks, capturing over 7% of the global truck market. For an independent competing against General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, that number was remarkable. The total 2R production run reached roughly 273,000 trucks before it ended in December '53. But behind those numbers, something was rotting from the inside. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. Okay, back to it. Studebaker's labor costs were the highest in the automotive industry, not by a little, by 12 to 15% above the industry average. The company had never had an official UAW strike. That sounds like good management. It wasn't. It was the result of decades of wage concessions that nobody had the courage to renegotiate. Studebaker workers and retirees were among the best paid in the entire auto business. The company was spending roughly 25% more to build each vehicle than it would have cost Chevrolet to build something equivalent. For trucks, the math was similarly ugly. Higher costs per unit, with lower volume to absorb them. The South Bend factory compound was part of the problem too. 82 acres of buildings, old and sprawling, with a layout inherited from the wagon building era. It had been adapted for automobile production over the decades, but never properly modernized. The flow of materials through the plant was inefficient. Bottlenecks existed where there shouldn't have been bottlenecks. One historian argued that the factory's antiquated configuration contributed as much to high per-unit costs as the generous labor agreements, but fixing it required massive capital investment. Capital required volume, and volume was exactly what Studebaker was losing. Then came the event that broke the independence. In 1953, Ford decided it was going to reclaim the #1 sales position from General Motors. Ford ramped production massively. GM responded in kind. Both companies slashed prices and flooded dealer lots with discounted vehicles. a full-scale price war between the two largest automakers in America. The independents, Studebaker, Packard, Hudson, Nash, none of them could match those prices. Their margins were already thinner, their volumes were already lower, their fixed costs were already higher per unit. When the two biggest companies in the industry start a knife fight on price, everyone else bleeds, and Studebaker was bleeding badly. Truck sales dropped by 2/3 between 49 and 53. The 2R, for all its design innovation, had been starved of updates and investment. Studebaker's budget constraints and declining interest in the truck line meant the design barely changed across 5 model years. A mild refresh in 54 produced the 3R with a new full-width ivory-colored grille, integrated headlights, single-piece windshield, and an updated dashboard. It wasn't enough. The 3R couldn't even hold the already declining sales numbers. By the mid-50s, the truck line was an afterthought in a company fighting for its own survival. Now let's talk about what was actually under the hood and why the engineering mattered even as the company was crumbling. The early 2R trucks ran flathead inline sixes. The base Economizer displaced 169.6 cubic inches, making 80 horsepower. That was the lowest power output of any half-ton pickup sold in 1949. The optional Power Plus was 226 cubic inches at 94 horses, reserved for the heavier 3/4-ton and 1-ton models. Both were workhorses, slow, dependable, fuel-efficient workhorses. By 51, the compression ratio on the smaller engine went from 6.5 to 7 to 1, bumping output to 85 horsepower. A larger optional 6, making 102 horsepower, also became available that year. The real change came with the V8. Studebaker introduced its overhead valve V8 for passenger cars in 1951, making it the first independent automaker with a modern V8 engine. But it didn't reach the domestic truck line until 54 in the 3R series. The truck version displaced 232.6 cubic inches and produced 127 horsepower. Finally, real power for the truck buyer. For 55, the trucks were redesignated as the E-Series, and the V8 became available in the half-ton for the first time. The chassis was conventional but solid. Ladder frame, solid axles front and rear, leaf springs all around, 3-speed column shift manual on lighter models, 4-speed on heavy-duty trucks. In 50, Studebaker offered overdrive on the half-ton, another light truck first. Variable ratio steering was standard. For 57, 4-wheel drive became available through Napco, the same outfit that supplied Chevrolet and GMC. The double-wall bed deserves its own moment. Most competitors used single-wall construction in their cargo boxes. Load something heavy, bang it around, dents show right through the outer skin. Studebaker's design used an inner wall that absorbed the punishment while the outer wall stayed clean and presentable. Simple idea, effective execution. Nobody else offered it. Combined with the smooth exterior surface it created, this feature alone made the 2R and its successors genuinely better work trucks than much of what the big three were selling. The company tried a rescue merger in 54. Studebaker-Packard Corporation, two financially wounded independents trying to create a fourth force in the industry. Packard's chief financial officer calculated the combined break-even at about 286,000 units per year. Studebaker executives had told Packard the number was closer to 166,000 during merger negotiations. That gap should have been a red flag the size of Indiana. From 54 to 58, the combined company never posted a single profitable year. The Packard brand was dropped in 58 after 2 embarrassing years as a rebadged Studebaker. The merger had failed completely. By 58, desperation was the only product Studebaker had in quantity. They introduced the Scotsman pickup, a stripped-down half-ton priced at $1,595. the cheapest pickup in America. It used a modified version of the 49 grill to save on tooling costs. Spartan in every way imaginable. It sold adequately, but adequately wasn't going to save anyone. Then the Lark arrived in '59, and briefly, everything changed. This compact car was based heavily on existing components, including the center body section of the 1953 cars. But it was cleverly packaged, well-priced, and it hit the market before GM, Ford, or Chrysler had their own compacts ready. First-year sales exceeded 150,000 units and delivered an unexpected $28 million profit. Studebaker was solvent. Dealers were smiling. The press was calling it a comeback. Then General Motors launched the Corvair. Ford launched the Falcon. Chrysler launched the Valiant, all in 1960. Then the so-called senior compacts arrived for '61. Lark sales collapsed almost overnight. The reprieve lasted barely a year. But the Lark did give birth to one final truck, the Studebaker Champ. In 1960, the engineering team received $900,000 to modernize a truck line that hadn't seen a meaningful update in over a decade. $900,000. That's barely enough for a single new body stamping by Big Three standards. So they improvised. They took a Lark four-door sedan, cut it in half behind the front doors, and grafted the front section onto the existing truck chassis. The only completely new stamping was the rear cab wall. They designed a tougher horizontal bar grille instead of the Lark's delicate mesh. The old cargo bed and the 15-year-old ladder frame carried over from '49. The slogan was, "Tougher than the job." The Champ looked surprisingly good for something stitched together from borrowed parts. And it pioneered features that are now universal on every pickup truck in America. The sliding rear window. The Champ offered it from the start, and it proved so popular that every major truck maker eventually copied it. Car-like interior comfort with a wide bench seat and a properly styled dashboard years before the competition caught on. Fiberglass service bodies for electricians, plumbers, and other tradespeople were available in '63 and '64, decades before composite bodies became an industry conversation. For '61, Studebaker added a wider cargo box called the Space Side. They didn't engineer it. They bought the tooling from Dodge, specifically from the 58 to 60 Dodge swept line. A second-hand cargo bed from a competitor bolted onto a chassis from '49 behind a cab built from a '59 compact sedan. That was Studebaker truck engineering in the early 1960s. Resourceful, creative, and operating on the thinnest of margins. Champ production told the entire story in numbers, about 5,500 units in both '60 and '61. A peak of 7,325 in '62, 5,861 in '63. A final run of just 2,509 for '64 before the line went dark. Total production across 5 model years came to roughly 28,000 trucks. Ford was moving hundreds of thousands of F-Series pickups annually. Studebaker's entire truck output for half a decade was less than what Ford sold in a couple of months. The collapse accelerated through '62 and '63. A 38-day strike hit the South Bend plant in January '62. In May, NBC aired a television program called Studebaker, Fight for Survival. That title tells you everything. The media narrative of impending doom became self-fulfilling. Buyers stopped walking into Studebaker dealerships. Nobody wanted to be stuck with an orphan vehicle from a company that might not exist next year. No part supply, no warranty service, no resale value. The fear fed the decline, and the decline fed the fear. Studebaker President Sherwood Egbert, who had been fighting cancer while simultaneously trying to save the company, was forced out in November '63. His replacement, Finance VP Byers Burlingame, made one final attempt to secure outside financing for new models. He failed. Less than a month later, on December 9, 1963, the South Bend Tribune broke the news. Studebaker was closing South Bend. Newspaper carriers brought the addition to Gate 1 at the factory. Workers were stunned. One man kept hollering it wasn't official yet. It was. The last car rolled off the line December 20th. The last Champ truck was built 7 days later. December 27th, 1963. The final Studebaker truck ever produced. 7,000 workers were on the payroll when the doors closed. At its peak, the plant had employed 24,000. Unemployment in South Bend leapt from 5% to 9.1% within a single month. President Johnson assembled a federal task force spanning 6 government departments to coordinate the response. The state paid out more than $5.5 million in unemployment benefits in '64 alone. Other automakers sent recruiters to South Bend to fill out their own growing workforces, and Kaiser Jeep moved in to take over Studebaker's military truck contracts. But the worst damage wasn't about jobs, it was about pensions. Studebaker's retirement plan was underfunded by $15 million. Workers already retired or over 60 received their full benefits. Everyone else got devastated. Workers under 60, including some who had given the company 40 years of their lives, received a lump sum worth roughly 15 cents on every dollar they'd been promised. Workers under 40 received nothing, not a fraction. Nothing. Decades of loyal service and the pension they'd built their retirement plans around simply vanished. More than 8,500 people lost some or all of their promised retirement benefits. The Studebaker pension collapse became the most infamous case of corporate pension failure in American history. It drew national outrage and gave Congress the political will to act. Over the next decade, it became the primary catalyst for the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, ERISA, the law that established minimum funding standards for pensions, created vesting requirements so workers couldn't lose benefits they'd earned, and built the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation as a safety net. Every American worker with a defined benefit pension today has Studebaker's failure to thank for that protection. Gordon Grundy, head of the Canadian operation, convinced the board that the Hamilton, Ontario plant could continue building Larks at a break-even of just 20,000 units per year. Production tooling was transferred to Hamilton, but the trucks were dropped permanently. So were the Hawks and the Avanti. Studebaker stopped making its own engines entirely, switching to Chevrolet 6s and V8s for the '65 models. Hamilton produced cars for 2 more model years. On March 17, 1966, the last Studebaker ever built came off the line. 114 years after Clement and Henry opened that blacksmith shop in South Bend. The longest continuously operating vehicle manufacturer in American history was finished. So why does any of this matter now? Because Studebaker's truck story is the story of what happens when you can't scale and what you leave behind when you're gone. The 2R was a better designed pickup than what Ford or Chevy offered in 1949. The double wall bed, the exterior-mounted gas tank, the integrated fenders, the thoughtful engineering details. Studebaker was genuinely innovating at the product level, but innovation without volume is an expensive hobby. Ford could spread the cost of a new truck platform across hundreds of thousands of units. Studebaker had to spread it across 30 or 40,000. Every improvement cost more per truck. Every year without an update widened the gap between what they offered and what buyers expected. The Champ proved you could build a competitive pickup on almost nothing, $900,000, and a pile of borrowed components. That's resourceful. But resourceful only works for so long when your competitors are spending tens of millions on new models every cycle. And buyers notice? They notice when your chassis is 15 years old. They notice when you can't offer power steering and the dealer down the street can. The Studebaker Drivers Club still has over 12,500 members worldwide. The National Museum sits in South Bend. People restore these trucks and drive them thousands of miles to annual meets. If the company were still around, it would be the oldest automaker on the planet. Founded 1852. Longer than Ford, longer than General Motors, longer than anyone. But it isn't around, because being first doesn't matter if you can't keep up. And keeping up costs money that a company from South Bend with the highest labor costs in the industry, an 82-acre factory built for wagons, and a truck line running on a 15-year-old chassis simply did not have. The Studebaker brothers started with an anvil and 25 cents. Their company built trucks that helped win a world war and designed pickups that were genuinely ahead of their time. And when it finally collapsed, it accidentally rewrote American retirement law for every worker who came after. That's not a bad legacy for a blacksmith shop. And there you have it. The company that built nearly 200,000 trucks for the Red Army, but couldn't build enough pickups to survive peacetime. If you've got one in your garage, or your dad used to talk about his, tell me about it in the comments. Subscribe if you want more of these. We do this every week.